Hey guys, thank you so much for coming to my channel. If you haven't here before, thank you for coming back. And if this is your first time, thank you for stopping by. My name is Nicole and I am a Scrum Master. On today's topic, we're going to talk about one of the Scrum Artifacts. But before I go into that, I want to give you guys a shout out for coming to my channel, for all your continued support. I really receive all your messages. I've not been able to reply to all of you guys because there's just too many messages that I'm getting. I just want to let you guys know that I'm receiving everything. If I've not been able to get back to you, my apologies. I'm going to do my best to get in touch with each and every one of you guys. Thanks for all your support. I really appreciate all the love. Let's continue to share these videos. Let's continue to like. Let's continue to comment. If you have any specific topic you would like me to talk, please leave me a message below, or you can email me at nicole.agilepractitioner@gmail.com. Again, my email is nicole.agilepractitioner@gmail.com. So on today's topic, we're going to talk about the sprint backlog. So Scrum has some artifacts, right? The main artifacts in Scrum is you have your product backlog, you have your sprint backlog, then you have your increment. But before we go deeper into talking about the sprint backlog, let's first of all understand what the product backlog is. So what really is the product backlog? A product backlog pretty much is the list that contains everything that your team is going to work on. So your product backlog stores all your user stories that your team is ever going to work on for either by the time you guys are done producing the product, or whatever your team is trying to deliver is going to be stored in your product backlog. However, your sprint backlog only contains a selection of items from the product backlog into your sprint backlog. So your team members or your product owner is going to prioritize the product backlog and select the stories that are adding value to the product, the stories that are high priority, the stories that are part of your MVPs. They're going to move those stories from the product backlog into your sprint backlog. So some of the benefits of having your sprint backlogs are, it helps to promote transparency. It's really important because you might have people that are not part of your team, maybe want to check on the board to see what the team is working on. They could not go on the board. They will be able to see the sprint backlog. They will be able to see what is assigned to which of your team members, right? Or even just the product owner, maybe just want to see where the team is at with their work. The product owner can just go on Jira and just check on the sprint backlog and see what the team is working on or what is assigned to which team member in your team. Another benefit of having your sprint backlog is it helps to outline what your team is delivering for that specific sprint, right? So the sprint backlog only contains the items that your team is going to be working on for that particular sprint. So in your sprint backlog, you will see what is assigned to each and every one of your team members, like your developers, your testers. If you want to see what they're working on, you go into your sprint backlog. You're going to be able to see all of the items that the team had accepted to work on for that particular sprint. So who really creates the sprint backlog? You can actually, you the Scrum Master can create on Jira. You can just go and create like the sprint backlog, but who actually pulls stories into the sprint backlog? The product owner is going to be helping the team as well as the Scrum Master doing the backlog grooming to select the items from the product backlog to pull them into the sprint backlog. So we need the product owner support. Since the product owner is the one that knows exactly what is to be built, we need the product owner support or guidance to help us during our refinement meeting to select the stories that are part of our MVPs, the high priority stories from our product backlog. We then now move those items now into our sprint backlog. Because the sprint backlog is what your team members are going to be using throughout the entire sprint. If your sprint lasts for 2 weeks, during that 2-week timeline, your team is going to be using the items that are in the sprint backlog the entire sprint. So who manages the sprint backlog? Your entire development team members, your entire team members are responsible for managing the sprint backlog. However, the product owner manages the product backlog but the team manages the sprint backlog. The reason is the sprint backlog is already part of that sprint. The team already has work that are assigned to each of them. So it makes sense for them to manage the sprint backlog because that's what they're using the entire sprint. So they're going to be able to change the status update the status on the story they're working on. They are going to be able to add comment on the stories they're working on. They're able to pretty much manage the board. They're able to manage the sprint backlog because they're going to be using that on the day-to-day for the entire sprint. So when you really create the sprint backlog, you can create the sprint backlog doing your backlog grooming, right? But it doesn't mean that when you create your sprint backlog during the backlog refinement meeting, it doesn't mean that all the stories that you guys are pulling into the sprint backlog, it doesn't mean that your team is going to accept all of those work in the sprint planning meeting. You're just creating the backlog during the refinement just so your team have some type of understanding on what is possibly going to be coming up in the next sprint. So once you create the sprint backlog, your product owner is going to help you to pull the correct items from the product backlog into the sprint backlog. Once you guys are done pulling all the items, then you guys are going to start grooming them, right? You're going to start reviewing each and every one of those stories one by one. We want to make sure that the stories have clear definition, they have acceptance criteria, the team is able to provide the level of effort, they're able to estimate the story, they're able to tell us how long it will take them to achieve this work, right? Including the dev and testing. So we want to make sure that during the sprint backlog refinement, we are grooming the stories that are in the sprint backlog based on priority, based on what the product owner says. These are the stories that we must have in our upcoming sprint. So if you actually didn't have a backlog refinement meeting, you can also create your sprint backlog during the sprint planning meeting. But it's so important to actually have your refinement. So always make sure that for your 2-week sprint, you guys have at least 1 or 2 backlog refinement meeting to get the stories ready for your upcoming sprint. We want to make sure that our story meets our definition of ready before we are accepting the work in our sprint to prevent the team from not being able to deliver their work on time. So you can create the sprint backlog during your grooming session. If you did not have a grooming meeting, which you should then create the sprint backlog during your sprint planning meeting. So during your sprint planning meeting, once you guys meet, if you notice that the backlog for that sprint has not been created yet, the sprint backlog, go ahead and create the sprint backlog and then get the help from the product owner or the support from the product owner to help you to pull the correct stories from the product backlog now into that sprint backlog. Once you're done pulling all the stories that are priority or the must-have items or the MVP stories, now your team can review them one by one. Make sure that before your team accept any work into that sprint, we want to make sure it meets the definition of ready again, like I said, right? And the team are able to estimate. Again, your sprint backlog only contains the selected items from the product backlog that your team wants to focus on for that specific sprint. So you can actually have different sprint backlog because the different sprint backlogs belongs to the different sprint that you're going to be having, right? So you can only have one product backlog. However, you can have multiple sprint backlog because the multiple different sprint backlogs represent the different sprint that your team is ever going to be having. So if you log into Jira and you see that there's so many different sprint backlog that has been created, it's just because your product owner or maybe the Scrum Master had created those multiple different sprint backlogs for the different sprint, so that way the team can prioritize the work, so the product owner can select the work that belongs to each and every one of those different sprints and put those user stories in the correct sprint. But you can only have one product backlog because your product backlog stores everything that your team is going to be working on. We go in there, prioritize the work, select the works that belongs to the different sprint, and then put those user stories there. So when we meet in our refinement meeting or in our sprint planning meeting, we are only focusing on what is in that specific sprint backlog for that specific sprint. So that's it about your sprint backlog. If you do have any other comments or topic that you would like me to talk about, please do go ahead and leave me a message below, or you can always email me at nicole.agilepractitioner@gmail.com. Thank you again for stopping by, and I hope to see you guys soon.